Conservative motion related to LGBT refugees failed to pass in the House of Commons this week. It sought to make a pilot project launched in 2011 permanent. The program is known as the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Program, and it helps bring people to Canada who've been persecuted abroad based on their sexual orientation, gender, or HIV status. The Liberal government had recently extended the pilot by another 2 years, but Conservatives want it made permanent. Why? Joining me from the foyer of the House of Commons Conservative Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship critic, Michelle Rempel. Hi, Ms. Rempel. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so your motion calls on the government to increase the ratio of LGBT refugees that Canada welcomes. Is there an implication there that you think the government is sort of deliberately not doing that?
Well, we've seen in the last couple of years the number of LGBTQ refugees, particularly from countries like Iran, where they face extreme persecution, drop. Actually, the numbers by 85%. So a lot of civil society groups have raised a flag saying this is concerning. And programs that have been designed to help where we see emergent situations of persecution, such as in Chechnya last year, have been suspended. So we feel that the LGBTQ community are some of the most persecuted people in the world and in need of Canada's protection, and we'd like to see that protection increase.
On the Iranian example, my understanding is that the number of refugees referred by the UN has dropped significantly. So could that explain why LGBT Iranian refugees, that number has dropped as well?
Well, you raise a really good point, and that's that certain persecuted minority groups often have a hard time getting into the UN referral process. We saw this with the Yazidi genocide, which is why we called upon the government to work outside of the UNHCR process to ensure that those minorities were actually being reflected in our refugee system. And this is because, and it makes perfect sense, let's say you identify as gay, you're in a country like Iran, it's going to be very difficult for you to make it to a UNHCR camp where you might face persecution both by people making the selection process and by the majority of people that are living in the camp that hold that belief. So this is why we need programs like the Rainbow RAP, civil society groups in Canada that are working almost like an underground railroad around the UNHCR process to help those most in need.
So you think the government should work around the UN?
Like we saw with the Yazidi genocide program worked in coordination with civil society groups that were on the ground to expedite protection levels. The same thing happened last year in December with the incidents of gay men in Chechnya who had a very hard time getting out of the country. The other complicating factor is many of these people are actually internally displaced, and to qualify for a UN refugee protection status, you have to make it outside of your country. So this is a policy gap that we've been pushing the government to close, and again, this is another example of a persecuted minority group that Canada has to be nimble and responsive in order to ensure that they receive the protection that they need.
When you talk about sort of civil society groups working outside of the UN, I think the one that you referenced in the motion is the Rainbow Refugee Group.
Yeah, there's many different groups. The Rainbow Railway Society of Canada. There's multiple groups, and I have to give them huge credit. These are people that are working on the ground in some really difficult conditions. They have the understanding of the on-the-ground conditions, the unique persecution factors that are happening to this group, and this is where we think that the government can take best practice from these groups, as well as sort of insert a level of nimbleness to make sure that we're understanding the fact that somebody who is gay in a country like Iran oftentimes can't wait for the 7 years it might take to be privately sponsored to Canada or to make it through the UN selection process.
That group, though, you're in the motion, are you asking for, I think you were asking for permanent funding, right? Even though I think they had asked for a year's funding and they got 2. So
there's a difference between the civil society groups and then the actual program. So we have a government program called the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Program, and that is the program that actually allocates the money to the groups that are doing this work. Those groups had actually asked Parliament through a parliamentary committee study over a year ago to make that program funding permanent, because even though they're getting this year-by-year funding right now, first of all, it's not enough. And second of all, without that permanence, this was, when we introduced it in our former government, it was as a pilot, so you know, to see if it would work. It clearly has demonstrated really good results, and we'd like to see that funding become permanent so that these groups can start actually planning out some of their activities over a 5-year period or longer, because sometimes that's how long it takes to actually put together systems in these countries in order to provide that protection or that awareness awareness within these communities that there is some place for people to go. And without that permanence, it's very difficult for those networks to be established and solidified.
So the government said that in a statement, they said they voted against the motion because of short notice and because it had funding implications, which is not typical for a motion. What's your reaction to that?
Okay, two things.
Do they have a point?
First of all, we did a parliamentary committee study on this well over a year ago, and this recommendation was unanimously accepted by the committee. I have raised this issue with the minister, I don't know, countless times. You can, in the estimates process, when he's at committee, in the House in question period, we have been demanding this for over a year, and frankly, I didn't think this was going to be a partisan issue. With regard to cost, they've just spent $200 million to process work visas for people who are illegally crossing the border from the United States. They spent $8 million on a hockey rink outside of Parliament Hill. I think $50,000 to save the lives of LGBTQ.
But they're not saying
that's
no.
Reasonable.
But they say no to the motion, but they're not saying no to the permanent funding, right? They say it's under consideration.
They have been saying no for the past year and a half. If they were going to say yes, they could have included it in this billion-dollar deficit budget where they blew hundreds of millions of dollars.
So you don't believe they're going to say yes ever?
I think that I have to continue to put political pressure on them in order to see some action. Their priorities have been extremely misplaced. I don't understand why they wouldn't have just said yes yesterday. This is something that we have been asking for across party lines, including even members from their own party, for 18 months now, especially given the change in emergent status for many of these groups. So look, I don't want this to be a partisan issue. The government should have, their response to you when you asked about this should have been like, yes, we're doing this today, not, oh, maybe we'll get around to it, because they've had a long period of time to do it, and in that time, people are dying.
Okay, I want to ask you more generally about the issue, because in the press release you said, or the press release itself said, an Andrew Scheer government will increase the ratio of LGBT refugees welcomed to Canada and make the program a fully promoted multi-year program that receives regular funding. Can I ask you that, how do you think there is a bit of mixed messaging? Andrew Scheer won't march in the Pride Parade. It was the Conservatives, when they were in government, that removed gay rights from the Citizenship Guide. Do you think it'll be hard to convince anyone that that is truly the case?
First of all, it was our government. We were the first government to actually include LGBT rights in the Citizenship Guide. That's a fact. Second of all, you know, Conservatives have stood up for the rights of the world's most vulnerable for a long period of time. I have no problem, and virtually everyone in my party will tell you how important it is to understand that the LGBTQ community is among the most persecuted in the world. We don't have systems in place to protect them. I was just in Uganda last week and very moved by seeing a trans woman who was beaten as part of trying to find refugee protection. You know, this compassion is not a partisan issue. My leader, Andrew Scheer, has been very clear about this. It was him who had actually asked the government for protection on gay Chechnyan men who were facing a fate of concentration camps.
But what about support for gay people in this country?
No, I want to finish. This is a very consistent message. And every time we have an opportunity to stand up for human rights, we do. I certainly have done that, and I'm very proud that my leader took this stance today as well. And in terms of in this country, yes, let's go there. We support, it's right in our party's policy document, we support the equality of opportunity of all individuals. And this is why we advocate for lower taxes, small government. Just because we have a different approach to policy in terms of high deficits, taxations, low metrics, as you're seeing with this particular motion, it just belies the fact that we want to help Canadians, regardless of their gender identity, expression, sexuality, ethnicity, religion.
But is there not a bit of a mixed message that Mr. Scheer won't march in a Pride Parade?
How is it a mixed message for my leader to come out and say that he wants to increase the ratio of LGBT people coming to Canada who he acknowledges is facing persecution, put forward a motion in the House of Commons asking for more funding for this, and I'm sitting on national TV trying to defend the fact that we're standing up for human rights. My leaders took concrete action today. He put forward a concrete policy that to me is a no-brainer. He's taking action to support this community, and it's very strong, decisive action. By contrast, the Prime Minister, who is marching in the Pride Parade, voted against that motion. And I think, you know, regardless of political stripe, regardless of the politics of pride, what we're aiming at is real action for this community. I am very proud of the fact that my leader and my party are standing up for this today, and I wish Justin Trudeau would have supported that motion yesterday. It's ridiculous that he didn't.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Rempel. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.